welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a historian and a journalist and a writer who is here to talk about an extremely important and timely book. Thank you for coming to our show to speak with our listeners. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and the book, please?
Of course, my name is Arash Azizi. I'm originally from Iran, and my book is about Iran. It's called What Iranians Want, Woman, Life, Freedom. And it is an account of the uprising that Iranians staged in 2022, 2023. And it's an attempt really by me to show all the reasons for which Iranians came out and the sort of richness of social movements and civil society in Iran, of people fighting for women's rights, people fighting for freedom of expression, and all the other demands that animated this revolutionary movement in Iran.
It's such a fascinating account, and it really reveals that the width and the breadth of Iranian activism is so much more comprehensive and addresses so many different societal things than I had originally imagined. Could you talk a little bit about your career and the journey to this book? I know that you spent some time at NYU, and I am an NYU alumna. So yeah, could you talk about what led you to this project?
Violet Pride. Yeah, so before anything more relevant to the book, since my teenage years, I was an activist in Iran, and like many other Iran and my compatriots of especially of my generation, we were fighting this nasty dictatorship, the Islamic Republic, that ruled over our lives. We fought its restrictive rules, and that struggle has always animated me in whatever else that I do. I was also a journalist in Iran. And when I left Iran, which is about 15, 16 years ago, when I was 20, I left Iran for Canada, and then I've lived in a couple of other countries along the way. But I've always continued the same thing. I've continued journalism. Because of the restrictions inside Iran, much of the Iranian journalism is done outside, from London, where Persian language broadcasters, and there are sort of different newspapers, the websites. I've worked with a variety of them over the years. And I also worked in sort of global media. I used to work at the BBC in Britain. But at some point, I wanted to get a deeper understanding of the sort of history that we were faced with, both in relation to my country and sort of the global left that I saw myself as a part of. So I ended up going back to school. Basically, I actually I left. I was a TV anchor for a London-based broadcaster to Iran, and I left that TV job, and I went back to school. So I got an MA in history in Berlin, and then I pursued my PhD in NYU, where I got a PhD in history and Middle Eastern studies. But I've never, I've been always between the two worlds, if you will, of academia and journalism. I never want to just speak to academics or write books that 9 people read. So it's been an attempt to write books that can engage with the broader public. And I love the conversation that we're having now, because that's exactly the goal of this book, that I want Americans and people around the world who can read English learn more about Iran, not via 30-second clips on media, but a sort of a deeper account of our people's struggles and what we're standing for. So this kind of audiences is exactly what I had hoped to achieve by writing books like this.
Yeah, I'm really interested in your perspective as a historian and a journalist. Because you are looking backward and you are also looking forward to, what the movement looks like now and how it will look in the future. And, this is all so recent and it's still evolving too. So could you talk a little bit about, combining those perspectives of history and journalism and what it's like to try to describe history as it is unfolding?
That's a very good question, and it's something that I think about a lot. A lot of times I think of journalism as, I think, they say what first draft of history, or history of the present is sort of term that people use. For me, I have throughout years of being a historian, I've sort of have a historian's approach to things, if you will, i.e. my answer to a lot of questions is rooted in, okay, let's look at its history. Let's look at sort of what happened there. And inevitably, that's also the case with this book. And it's something that sounds simple, but I think we often miss the history of things. And unfortunately, history in a lot of places has a sort of a reputation of being a bit boring. There's that famous saying, there's one damn thing after another, right? And all my attempts as a historian is to show, no, it doesn't need to be one damn thing after another. Actually, it can be a animating and fascinating story. And actually, without it, we will be lost, right? So this book, when I wanted to write it, I wanted to write a book about the movement, right? And this was when the movement was going on. And one approach would have been to just write about what was happening on the streets, basically, what was happening in 2022 and 2023. That would be, for me, a compilation of media reports, basically some more interviews with some people, but that's not what I had in mind. What I wanted to do was to give color and weight and historical backing to all the different sort of streams that had come together to make this movement possible in 2022. So if you look at, for example, the central demand of the movement in 2022 was a fight against this compulsory hijab. Iran is the only country in the world now, with the possible addition of Afghanistan, where women are forced to cover their head. No other country in the world, no other Muslim country or otherwise, has such draconian law that tries to force this on women. How did it start? I mean, it started with the 1979 revolution. And guess what? Before the revolution had even consolidated, before there was even an Islamic Republic, women came out in Iran and fought against this. And they were told that this didn't matter, that, that it wasn't important, that it wasn't a priority, that now we were having a revolution. And so that's how I start the book. There is one of the characters in the book, Homa Nateq, it's this Iranian woman activist against the government in 1979, who had famously said, "Oh, I don't care about the hijab. This is not important." And she ends up saying in a quote that I have, that I learned that those who want to control your body and what you wear will also control what you think, right? So a quote from 30, 40 years ago might not have seemed relevant to the movement now, but I think it was very relevant, because it really shows what a long way we came, and we as the Iranian society, to understand those women who came out in March 8, 1979, and we didn't listen to them. I mean, I wasn't born yet, right? But my compatriots didn't listen to them. And so similarly with other parts of the book, I tried to show that, look, these movements didn't start from yesterday, and they're not all a simple sort of government versus the people. There's a movement for freedom of expression. There's environmental rights movement. There's a movement for Afghan refugees. There are movements against Iran's sort of foreign policy and interventionist policies in the Middle East. And that, there is really a backing to this. So I hope what I tried to do was to use history, a lot of it recent history of the last 10, 20 years, to show really what the movement that is happening is all about. And I think, as I said, often this gets lost, and we hear an account of, let's say, revolution in Sudan or Egypt or Chile, and it sort of becomes, people are angry, they hate the government, right? But if you don't know the background, it becomes harder to understand, why people risk their lives for change.
Absolutely. And I think recovering that deeper history that a lot of Americans are unaware of, like the fact that the hijab protests stretch back that far, is itself, I guess, in a way, like an act of activism, right? Because one thing that you talk about a lot is that the current supreme leader, Khomeini, manipulates the media in order to suppress journalism and to, manipulate what people see and don't see, and so recovering that deep history, because those who try to control the media in the present are also going to try to control the way that you view your own history, right? So can you talk a little bit about maybe that, like the role of the media in Iran and how that is affecting the situation?
Of course, yeah. And, you mentioned the sort of people not knowing, there was a former president here who said, oh, they like hijab back then, we shouldn't have anything to do with it. So I hope that, if he gets a copy, he can see that, no, actually, people have struggled against this for a long time. There's a lot of conversations now about the role of media in the United States. A lot of us are, very sad and gutted by the gutting of media. Just a few weeks before our conversation, Los Angeles Times, laid off, I don't know, more than 100 journalists. There are newspapers closing down everywhere. And I think, this country, United States, its freedom of speech, its tradition of vibrant journalism all over the country, like not just big national papers, but there are papers in little towns in South Dakota that have done Pulitzer-winning style journalism for decades. And unfortunately, in our generation, as we speak, it's being lost. And I think if you look at a country like Iran, you will see why the role of journalism is so important. And perhaps not take for granted, what you can have when there is a freedom of the speech. In Iran, journalism is a very vibrant scene in which people stake a lot, and they pay a very high price. Iranian prisons is full of journalists. The journalists who, for example, as you know, the movement in Iran started when Mahsa Amini, a young Iranian woman, was killed in September 2022 when she was arrested by the police because she was supposedly not wearing her headscarf properly, and sort of they killed her. Journalists who work on that story, who broke that story, spent a long time in jail. In fact, they're only recently out and on. Basically, they're out on bail, but they spent a couple of years in prison. So many others have. And yet Iranian journalists go out time and time again, doing stories on, corruption, on how much Iran is spending in its military adventures in the region, and sort of many other important stories like that. And they give all they have. It's not just the fear of being in prison. It's also the fact that how can you have a career in a place like that? I've been in newspapers where it gets closed down, and it's a place you went to work every day, and you had lunch there, you did work there, and then the day after there's a lock on the door, and you cannot go in because the judges of the Islamic Republic decided so. So repressing journalism and what people can talk about is a very primary function of dictatorships, and that's what Islamic Republic does. And I think that should remind us of how important the role of journalism is, and what we will lose if we don't have it. If we all reduce to facts on TikTok and sort of word of mouth, and we don't have this sort of guardians of reality that go there day in and day out, and follow stories and investigate stories, there will be huge loss. And I'm very proud and happy to say in Iran, despite all of this, there is still an active independent journalism, both for journals and outlets abroad, but even for those inside Iran, despite all restrictions, they continue and they do very important work. And they're, some of the biggest heroes that I've ever known.
Mm. Yeah, it is really incredible to come to understand that sort of media landscape and all of the really important work that is being done under these conditions. Speaking of, activism, journalism as activism, and how we can support that from far away, what are things that, Americans who read this book and want to understand the situation better and perhaps to support a free media, like what kind of things can we do from afar?
Well, this conversation in the United States is very fruitful because, as you know, there's a very large diaspora of Iranians. There are a couple millions of us here in the United States, and they're often very active, doing great work for the movement back home. There are organizations here that you can get involved with and help. My personal suggestion is United for Iran, which is an organization based in Berkeley, California, but it really works, it does a lot of work in relation to Iran. There are tons of people on the ground who, in one way or another, or benefit from the kind of support that it gives. What I love about United for Iran is that it's not about itself. It's not about sort of diaspora. It's not about us like showing our identity or feelings by supporting a cause. It's really about supporting those brave men and women in Iran who are on the front lines of Iranian civil society. So yeah, that's that's one organization that I recommend, and I also recommend just keeping up on Iran, following our stories. And struggles, and giving us hope, giving a talk about our struggle, because it's a lonely struggle in many ways. We've faced this tough repressive regime since 1979, and we fought it time and time again. Unfortunately, victory has yet eluded us, but we can really rely on sympathy and help, spreading the word, and as I also said, organizations like United for Iran or others that you can find, who help the Iranian struggle in one way or the other. Yeah, and I myself, I'm on social media and sort of Instagram, Twitter, and others, and always happy for people who want to reach out to know more or find avenues where they can show us solidarity. I'm always happy to have those conversations.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah. And those are some really, I think, good and fruitful, first steps for people who want to know more and get involved. And finally, I'm really glad that you brought up hope, especially in the context of like the long sort of intergenerational nature of this struggle. Something that I really admired about the book is that it does a very good job, I think, of balancing a sort of like clear-eyed, realistic view of what is going on the ground with a sort of long-term hope, that helps you stay engaged and stay present. So can you talk about, what goes into balancing those moods or those perspectives? Like, how do you keep yourself, in the right mindset, in order to stay engaged, if that makes sense,
Of course, yeah. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian revolutionary, famously said you should have a pessimism of intellect and optimism of will. Don't fool yourselves about the odds, but also put all you have optimistically into your chances of success. And I think it's a good advice for any activist, and is what I've always tried to have in relation to Iran. But I should also say that there are many reasons to be sort of forlorn, if you will, or sad about the state, because state of the movement in Iran. Because after all, we were, as I said, unable to dislodge the Islamic Republic. We're unable to really present a coherent political alternative. And one main reason for that is that in Iran, anytime there are tons of people who could be great leaders in Iran, but they're in prison. Narges Mohammadi, this great inspiration for a lot of us, who won the Nobel Prize last year, Nobel Peace Prize. She's spent most of the past few decades in prison, has barely spent few days with her children. She barely gets to even speak to them on the phone. And that's just one example. There are tons of Iranian trade unionists, feminists, journalists who are in prison, filmmakers even, right? And these are the people who could have helped cohere an alternative. So there's a lot of reasons for sort of for pessimism and the reality that this has eluded us. The other fact, though, is that the regime, the Islamic Republic, has really shown its bankruptcy and the bankruptcy of its policies, and it's sort of in a dead end. And you would think that at some point, as I sort of predict in the epilogue to the book, that they would have to change some of these policies and open up, even for its own survival, to save itself from the sort of economic retardation and everything else that is experiencing. But I think the key fact that gives me hope is the fact that I'm 36 now, and I've been at this for some time. It's a feeling in the, I don't know, mid to late 30s that you already feel like you've been at it for a while. But I'm so inspired by these young people who keep continuing to come out, and keep continuing to fight, and they're not. I don't live in Iran, but they do, and they haven't given up hope. It's amazing for me, the resilience of my people. This book, in many ways, is a love letter, if you will, to my compatriots, who I'm awed by their continuing coming out, by their continued resilience, and by the high standards they set for themselves. Right? It's not just even though they live in some of the most repressive conditions in the world, Their demands when it comes to gender issues, social issues, political issues are really high. They don't want to just be a little bit better, to be to live under a dictatorship that is a little bit better. But they set standards of the world to themselves. In the words of Sarina Esmailzadeh, 16-year-old girl who was killed in this movement, and it's the subject of my last chapter. She says, why shouldn't I want the best? Why shouldn't I want to live like teenagers my age in Berlin or Los Angeles? Or, she had a teenage view of the world, but looking at people who lived in countries that were democratic. Yeah, I think that's what gives me hope, that the resilience of my compatriots, who this book is dedicated to, and this book is really about.
Mm. Yeah, that's really lovely. And I think it does point to, I think people give teens a lot of hard times, but they can really be our moral center sometimes, and keep us, grounded and on track. So that's really great. Thank you so much for sharing this book with us, and this project, and, this perspective on what's happening. What are you working on now? What is next on the horizon for you?
Well, this book just came out, so after this is the second book that I've written, and usually after a book, you catch a breath and you promise yourself never to do this again. So I am there, but my dissertation was about the socialist movements in the Middle East, in the 20th century. So I might try to turn that into an sort of academic book, if you will, about about that topic. But I don't know. Right now I'm more doing interviews like this, and talking about this book, and hoping to get the message out about the freedom movement in Iran.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining us. And, I hope you enjoy your little rest in between projects, and best of luck on the next one.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor.
Oh, it was a delight and an honor. Thank you. Listeners, it's now your turn. Please check out What Iranians Want: Women, Life, Freedom. By the time that you hear this, it will be available out in the world. So please head to your favorite bookstore or library. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.